Well, if you want to turn to one of our four options here, which is Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, John 18, almost John right at the end of 18, going into 19. We're going to finish up the Roman trial portion, which was at least slightly more of a trial than the Jewish portion was. Remember the three stages of the Jewish so-called trial, then the three stages of the Roman trial. We looked at the first two Sunday afternoon. We see Pilate kind of struggling a little bit, not to get him off the hook or anything, or cut him more slack than he deserves. But he said he found no guilt in Jesus, but the Jews insisted that he be killed. Then he thought he found a way out when he heard that Jesus was from Galilee. So he sends him to Herod, who was Pilate's equivalent in that portion of Israel. But that didn't work out. Now Herod sends Jesus back. So what was Pilate to do now? Well, John provides us with some details, maybe that are not there in the others, which he does often. And we'll ask ourselves also, what will we do with Jesus? What was Pilate going to do with Jesus? He had a choice. The Jews had a choice. Judas had a choice even. We have a choice. In fact, Pilate's going to put the Jews really in a position to choose between two different people, and we'll see what they chose. Is there such a thing as a greater sin? That's something to think about, as we'll see. Jesus is going to make a comment along that line of greater sin. We may be inclined to say no instantly, but we'll see based on what Jesus says about Pilate and Caiaphas. We'll start, and that should say Luke 23, I believe. One of them's wrong, one of them's right. I'm almost positive it should be 23, yeah. So ignore that if you would have even noticed. It should say 23. We'll start in Luke. We'll read Luke's account, Luke 23, beginning in verse 13, and then we'll flip over to John's account. This is right after Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate, and Luke tells us that they became really good friends after that point because of whatever Herod had apparently done. Luke 23:13 says, Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him. But they all cried out together, Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, Crucify him, crucify him. A third time he said to them, Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him. But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. Okay, John's account, John 18, beginning in verse 38, right there at the end. Verse Well, I guess verse 38 says, Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And after he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So, that is the remainder of the trial before Pilate. There's one detail that Matthew mentions that we'll see in a few minutes that those two did not mention. But basically, Pilate is trying to find a way to get, again, really to get himself out of this mess. He at least has I don't even know if I'd call it sense or integrity. Jesus had literally done nothing wrong. And so, notwithstanding anything that these Jews were claiming that he did against their law, as far as Pilate was concerned, he had done nothing, and so he did not deserve to die. And he's saying this repeatedly. Of course, he does not want to condemn an innocent man, but lots of not overly great people wouldn't want to condemn an innocent man to death. I mean, it doesn't take very good of a person, really, to not want to kill an innocent person. So Pilate hasn't done too great a thing by declaring Jesus to be innocent, but he's trying to find a way out of this without putting him to death. And we're going to see, based on Matthew's detail that I mentioned, maybe one of the things that had a little bit of pull with Pilate as to why he was so adamant about this. But he does notice, he does say, propose that to punish him. Now, in this place, he doesn't say how. That's not until a little bit later. But why would he punish him if he's innocent? Do you think? He says, "This man is, I don't find any guilt in this man, but I'll punish him and release him." Well, wouldn't you think it would be, "This man is, I find no guilt in this man, therefore I will release him." That's what we would expect. So why would he say, therefore, since I don't find him guilty of anything, but then he also says worthy of death, but he says, I found in him no guilt, therefore I will punish him and then release him. Why do you think he did that?
Well, he was still crying out to crucify him, so he thought maybe this
Yeah.
I'm sure that's why he's thinking that, maybe if I do this, we won't want to crucify him.
Yeah, it seems that he thought this might be a way that will satisfy them, at least in the sense of after it's done, at least maybe it'll snap them out of it, maybe after seeing him after this punishment. Of course, that's assuming that they did see him after the punishment, which our lesson points out. Some see that whether this punishment was done right before the crucifixion or right then, although it seems more likely that he did it right at this time. Maybe that would, sort of at least turn them off to what they've been calling for, because many people would be, don't you think? If they saw somebody who had just been severely punished, they might have lost some of their bloodthirstiness, because they see the punished man who has already been declared innocent, and maybe that would be enough to satisfy them. So what we read is that Pilate ordered his men to go, and most of the older versions, or probably most of the versions in general, say scourged him. You probably agree with me that there has been so much emphasis placed on the scourging of Jesus over the years, in our studies, and yet look at how minimalistic it is in the narrative. There's not even an account of the scourging of Jesus. You may be shocked to notice that, because it's been mentioned so much, and in the movie, if you've seen the movie Passion of the Christ, it's one of the most horrific parts, in my opinion, far more horrific than the crucifixion itself, which is kind of makes you question, if that's, given the right message. But at any rate, all John says is, then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and that's it. There's no other detail, and the other accounts that mention it just mention it pretty much in the same manner, just in a different place, or seem to indicate that it was at a different place. But this scourging, one of the things, whenever there's no scriptural testimony, the next best thing that we can have is historical testimony, or secular testimony, about the way that the Romans normally did a scourging. And even then, we don't know exactly how they did it to Jesus, but we can get an idea. The risk or the danger of that I've observed anyway, is that sometimes people have a tendency to, get all the possible things that they could have done to Jesus or that they did at that time, ranging from, this to, on a list, and then cherry pick all the absolute most extreme worst things and then just assume that that's what they did to Jesus. And that's, in my opinion, what Mel Gibson did in the movie. But either way, it would not have been pleasant at all. It may not have been as insane as it's been depicted, but the purpose of it was to, in general, bring a criminal to the brink of at least wishing they were dead. But in this case, the purpose, like we said, seems to have been to try to satisfy the Jews. So it wouldn't have been, he wouldn't have wanted it to be too light, because then it would have not really served that purpose. He wanted it to be bad enough that it might satisfy them, but not so bad, that maybe it could have been. Yeah, Dean?
I thought I heard that sometimes some of the scourging did kill the individual.
Yeah.
How hard and energetic the one doing the punishment would, do. They can inflict a lot greater.
Yeah. The men that would have been doing this were not going to be very sympathetic men. And there's sort of a I don't know if I call it stereotype, but in prison, depending on what crime you committed, when you get there, you might be treated differently. There's sort of like a tier level of the kind of people that are going to be treated the worst, like pedophiles will be it's said anyway. I can't speak to the legitimacy of it, but depending on what a person has done, they may be treated way worse by the other inmates. Well, these guys that did this, I can't help but think that they probably had a similar way of doing things. Depending on what this criminal is accused to have done, they probably were more liberal with their lashings. I would assume. That's just an assumption. But whenever it's a man like Jesus, just the only slack we could possibly cut them is if they didn't know what he was accused of. But Pilate knew that he was innocent, and yet he was going to have this done to him anyway. Not that he was pleased to have to do it, but he didn't have to do it. That's the point. He didn't have to. He didn't have to do any of this. He could have simply released Jesus and stood up to his superiors and said, "Look, yes, they started another riot on my watch, but I knew this man was innocent, and I'll stand by I will defend him because he was innocent and he did not deserve any punishment, and I'll suffer the consequences." But Pilate was looking out for number one, which was Pilate. He tried, but he didn't try hard enough. So
Two, it was prophesied concerning Christ, what kind of death he was going to have.
Yeah.
Yes, he did have part where he could have, not done it, but the prophecy was there. So
It was going to be fulfilled, yeah.
Whether he did it or somebody else did it, it was going to be fulfilled.
Yeah. That takes us back to Mordecai and Esther, how Mordecai said, "Look, God's going to save our people somehow, but why don't you let him do it through you?" Well, that was talking about a good thing. That works for bad things too. In this case, this is going to happen. It's been prophesied. It is sure to happen. But as far as Pilate was concerned, that doesn't mean it has to be done because of him. So he could have recused himself, but this is again the mind-bending nature of prophecy and divine foreknowledge is God said it's going to happen because he had already seen it happen, and therefore it's going to happen. And yet, if Pilate knew about these prophecies, his mind would have been utterly blown, because here he's already confused because Jesus is who he is, the man that he sees him to be, not a man this is not a criminal, this is not a man who's worthy of death, and yet, no matter what I do or say, they are demanding that he be crucified of all things. This does not make sense. And if he knew about the prophecies, then it would have just multiplied that awe that he would have been in. Not that it would have changed his course necessarily, but it surely would have really had him scratching his head even more. Now, no reason to get into the details of the scourging that the inspired writers didn't see fit to describe. So he was whipped, obviously fairly severely, and then he seems to have presented Jesus back to them again. The details we are told is that the men mocked him. They put a robe. They did similar to what Herod had done. They put a robe on him. They put a crown of thorns on him. Jammed it into his head, and then were bowing down to him and stuff and mocking him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" Just petty, mean, cruel stuff. Yeah, Dean?
Yeah, they scourged him in that where normally the individual was being crucified, he would carry that cross beam, but he wasn't able to do it.
Yeah.
So they compelled somebody. So we can see that, he was weakened in a weakened condition.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't even do that. Now, whether he could stand or not, it doesn't really say, but I think he possibly could stand.
Yeah, part of it could be partly the effects of the scourging that contributed to him not being able to carry it. Of course, we know he also was up all night, and was exhausted anyway. There were plenty of factors that led to that, his weakness at that time. And the scourging obviously would not have helped matters. So it would have been excruciating, and then the sheer cruelty on top of it of how heartless and hard of a man it takes to mock and make fun of a man who's been declared innocent, and yet you've just beaten, that is sickening, to say the least. But these were hardened Roman soldiers who at a time and a place, I guess, when the sanctity of human life was less than it should be in general. And so here, even Jesus, the Son of God, who had never done anything worthy of rebuke, much less beating, is being mocked and slapped in the face and ridiculed in this way. Then they bring him to Pilate, who then presents him again to the Jews. And this is where we assume, probably, it seems that he was hoping they would be satisfied. Behold the man, he says. Not the king, just the man. Here he is, the man that you brought to me. Here he is. Happy? But they weren't, were they? Now, just like I talked about with the Roman soldiers, the Jews at this point would probably have seen him, whether or not he looked as he's been presented to have looked at the end of this scourging. That would have turned the stomachs of most people. But these Jews looked at Jesus. Notice, was it John's account that says, when they looked at him, after they saw him, after they looked at him, then they said, crucify him. So it did not do anything to satisfy them. They looked at the beaten, scourged Jesus and said, crucify him, crucify him. So that was Pilate's second attempt, what I've called his second attempt to release Jesus. It failed. Now, he's got one more trick, I guess, or one more hope. Some of the accounts present it as their suggestion, but regardless of who brought it up, this was his last hope, it seems. It was his custom around this time to release one prisoner from the stockade there in the city or whatever, and he puts it to them, would you like it to be Jesus? I release one man to you, one prisoner every year at this Passover time. You want it to be Jesus? He's already here, and I can just let him go. But they said, no, we do not want it to be Jesus. In fact, they went beyond that and said, there's another prisoner. And I think some of the other accounts seem to present it as Pilate gave them a multiple choice. And if that is the way of it, it almost seems like Pilate tried to stack the deck, so to speak. We got two choices this year. Jesus of Nazareth, or this man named Barabbas. And here's some of the things that we learn about Barabbas. Matthew says he was a notorious prisoner. John says he was a robber. Mark says he was a rebel. Luke says, similar to that he was convicted of starting an insurrection, which is a rebellion against the government. And Mark tells us also that he committed murder. So this man was a thief. He was notorious, a notorious rebel who actually started an insurrection and killed people in that insurrection, it seems. So these are their two choices. A man who's been declared innocent by the judge, and a man who's been convicted, ironically, of at least one of the things that Jesus had simply been accused of doing or not even accused of doing, but accused of eventually probably going to do, which was insurrection. So we have an alleged future insurrectionist or a convicted actual insurrectionist who's also a murderer, and they have to choose between these two. If that's the way that it happened, that was probably Pilate's cleverest attempt, because you would think, surely the Jews will not be happy about this, but they are going to have to say, forget this, release Jesus, and we'll deal with it later. Something like that. But they actually said, release to us Barabbas. And Pilate's mind is probably more and more swimming at this point. Yes?
Jesus represented all that is good, and of course Barabbas represents all that's evil. So the story ran with people that they chose evil instead of what was good.
Yeah.
What we do today, we either
Yep.
do good or we do evil.
Yep. That's the choice, isn't it? Two choices. And so many times we choose somebody else besides Jesus, don't we? Yeah.
Like in our time, like, we had the number one rated criminal of the, the FBI have number one criminal. Is it like Al Capone or Jimmy Hoffa or some of those other guys that, at one time they were number one. This Barabbas, no doubt he was number one to them, because they knew about it. And just like in our cases, well, we know about Jimmy Hoffa, Al Capone, and all that. They're all in the papers, right? I mean, they made a name for themselves, I'm sure.
Yeah.
He did too. Barabbas made a name for himself, because they called him by name.
Yeah. According to John's account, they brought him up, and interestingly, we know those men's names because for a reason. We know their name for a reason. You don't want those guys back on the street. If they're in prison, you want them to stay there, or to go on to meet their maker. Even better yet, when people have been convicted of murder, and other things like this man had, you don't want him out. It's a very fortunate thing that he has been caught. So the fact that they chose him, this 50-50, this was rigged. This was a rigged election on the part of Pilate based on, those other accounts. And they chose Barabbas. His name, that name, interestingly, it means son of the Father. And Alfred Edersheim proposed the, possibility that he may have actually been a false Christ, a false Messiah, because he says that was likely not his actual name, but Bar means son of, like Simon Bar Jonah means Simon son of Jonah or son of John or whatever. So we know Abba means father, and Bar Abba means son of the Father. And so it may be that Pilate sort of saw them as a connection. And if that's true, it makes it even more ironic that they chose to release the one who was obviously a false Messiah, to want to put to death this man. And even if he wasn't a false Messiah, he was guilty of the things that they were accusing Jesus to maybe be guilty of in the future. He's bound to give Caesar trouble because he claims to be a king. He's telling us we shouldn't be paying taxes, which again was a total lie. And they chose Barabbas. This is just, it gets more and more shocking as it goes along. And it was at this time that Pilate sat down on the judgment seat. We're told in Matthew 27, he sat down on the judgment seat. And also in John 19:13. And this is where Matthew throws in this very intriguing detail that's just mentioned as a matter of fact and then moves on, doesn't say a word about it. It says this, Matthew 27:19. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, have nothing to do with that righteous man. for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream. End quote. Moves straight on into the next thing. I mean, Matthew says, now the chief priests and elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. There's another detail that the others didn't mention. The leaders, the ones who were instigating all this, actually worked to persuade the crowd to all ask for Barabbas. That's how wicked these men were, utterly evil and base in every way. But isn't that interesting? The wife of Pilate says, I had a dream about this man today. And she urges her husband, have nothing to do with him. Or in other words, I guess we could paraphrase, do whatever you can to get yourself out of this. Remove yourself, recuse yourself, whatever. Don't have anything to do with the condemnation of that righteous man, she says, because of a dream she had. Now it's been suggested that, to the Romans, that would have been a big deal. Having a dream and omens based on dreams would have moved even a man like Pilate. And so even though in Matthew's account that doesn't get brought up even until here, but that surely would have had something to do with Pilate's actions. Of course, he still didn't do enough, but there has been all kinds of traditions surrounding his wife, whose name was supposedly Claudia. And there's even apparently a letter that supposedly was written by her. It very likely wasn't really written by her, and it's certainly not inspired. But in that letter, which has been preserved and, like I said, upheld in tradition, claims that Christ had healed her son on one occasion, that she was a friend of Jairus and witnessed to the raising of his daughter, or at least was there when it happened, and that she was a convert to Christianity. Other things as well. None of that is inspired and may not even be authentic, but it certainly is not incompatible with what we read here. And it's not implausible, especially in light of this verse here. But I thought this was an interesting statement, regardless of anything else we might say about this dream. Thus, just as Judas was warned by the Lord, God gave Pilate his warning also. If nothing else, his wife, I'm not suggesting that we know God gave her that dream, but however this dream came about, the fact that she sent this message to her husband should have been at least another light bulb going off saying, maybe I should try harder to do the right thing here. And sadly, he still leaves much to be desired. But he was uneasy about it seems, at least. And again, he said, which of the two do you want me to release for you? They said, Barabbas. And he said, okay, well then what am I supposed to do with Jesus who's called the Christ? And they said, let him be crucified. And he said, why? What evil has he done? And how'd they answer that? Matthew says, they shouted all the more, let him be crucified. What a great answer to that question, isn't it? Why do you want him to be crucified? What evil has he done? But they just kept shouting it even more. Let him be crucified. That's typical mob mentality, isn't it? They didn't listen to the reasoning or reason within themselves. They didn't have an answer why they wanted him to be crucified. What evil has he done? He had done no evil. And all they could do was shout even more, let him be crucified. And all the while, we can't forget that just as the chief priests and elders persuaded them to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus, or instead of Jesus, they were probably doing that same thing to get the crowd riled up against Jesus and to stir them up to this point. And that's exactly what has happened here. They have succeeded. Now the mob is shouting, let him be crucified, let him be crucified, crucify him, crucify him. Like a bunch of brute animals. A bunch of monkeys in a cage or something, going ballistic. Feral, wild animals. Matthew goes on, it says, "So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, 'I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves.'" Now, we could probably call this Pilate's fourth attempt, or maybe fifth or sixth attempt, but at least the fourth attempt, because this gesture would have meant something to any normal group of people or any jury. If accusers were demanding the death or the execution of a citizen or whatever, of an alleged criminal, and the judge declares him to be innocent and then washes his hand, does a gesture like this, and basically declares himself innocent of what they're demanding, no jury under normal circumstances would continue to demand that he be executed. They just would have sort of knocked some sense into them, and they wouldn't have had the courage to keep demanding it, because that would be such a strong gesture on the part of that judge. It just would have been frowned upon for them to still insist, "No, we don't care what you think, Judge, Your Honor. He deserves to die, and we're not going to stop until he's killed." But these people answered in the most terrifying words, it seems to me. "His blood be on us and on our children." That is incredibly unfortunate for them that they said that. And it seems that statement can be, the echo of those words can almost be seen in the Jews' history from that time. You could argue even to this day. There's a decent case to be made that there's something to be said of that declaration and the history of the Jewish people from the first century till now, or certainly in the near future from that time. And so, sad as that is, Pilate caves under the pressure. He caves, he gives in to their demands. He doesn't think that Jesus should be killed. He doesn't find any guilt in him. But he was fine with having him scourged, and he's fine with saying, "Okay, you see to it. I'm not having anything to do with this." Problem was, he did have something to do with it, because he could have prevented it. And just because it was prophesied doesn't excuse his guilt. And certainly just because he washes his hands of it, figuratively speaking, does that mean that he's innocent? He can declare that he's innocent of this man's blood. God says otherwise. Acts chapter 2 at least declares that he was not innocent of Jesus' blood. But he gives in to their demands. The mob mentality, the mob prevailed. And despite his attempts, they would not be satisfied with anything but seeing this man not just killed. They could have said, "Just take him out back again and whip him until he dies." Go whip him again until he dies. Because like Dean mentioned, that it has been recorded that some people, some of the criminals that had been scourged did die right there on the thing that they were attached to for their scourging. But they said, "We won't be satisfied until this man is crucified." Maximum punishment for an innocent man. Being tried under the greatest system of law that the world had ever known to that point. It's not anymore, but at that time, it was the greatest system of law. Just like, as far as I'm concerned, our system of law is the greatest system of law that's ever existed up to this time. Their system of law was the greatest that had ever existed up to that time. And Jesus, the most innocent man that ever lived, was condemned to the most maximum punishment reserved for at least absolutely, positively convicted criminals, and usually of the worst kind. That's what he was condemned to suffer. There's just so many things that show that, like he said, this is what's going to happen. And you're just going to have to accept it because this is what's going to happen. In fact, this is what is supposed to happen. And little did they know, but they would eventually, the apostles anyway, the disciples, he was doing this because it was God's plan for the salvation of the world. Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world is what John the Baptizer said, but he didn't say how he was going to do that, but this is how he was going to do that. And that's one of those things probably that Jesus referred to when he said, I have many other things I'd like to tell you, but you can't bear it yet. That's probably one of them, because they wouldn't have been able to understand that. But they would eventually when that helper came. So Pilate now has delivered him over to the Jews' demands. Of course, the Romans were still going to be the ones doing the punishment, the crucifixion. But when it says he delivered him over to them, it means he gave Jesus over to their will, their demand, which was to be crucified. So, application. Whom will you choose? Pilate gave them a choice. We have a choice every day. And unfortunately, we sometimes let the devil cloud our judgment, which is clearly what's going on in their case, just like with Judas. Devil clouded their judgment. Or maybe their own wills and ideas clouded their own judgment. They could not see clearly. That doesn't excuse anything they did, but it does explain how blind they could be. And we can be blind too, and blind ourselves. Who has the greater sin? We didn't mention that part, but we read it at least when Jesus says, you wouldn't have any authority over me at all if it hadn't been given to you from above. And he says, there is one, however, who's more guilty than you are. The one who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. That's Caiaphas. Jesus said Caiaphas has the greater sin. But why? I thought sin was sin was sin was sin. Don't we say that all the time? But Jesus said Caiaphas has the greater sin. What do you think? We know he knew something. He was a Jew for one thing, and so he knew a lot of things that Pilate didn't know. Not necessarily about Jesus himself, but the prophecies, the prophets. He had all the blessings of God for all these centuries. There's reference made to how the Jews, like Paul said, my countrymen, my heart goes out to them because of their current state in rejecting Jesus and being rejected by God. And he says, this is Israel we're talking about. They were given the prophets and the Father. They had all these things. So they, least of all people, or most of all people, have no excuse for rejecting Jesus. Nobody has an excuse, but they have the least excuse. Caiaphas is one of those people. And the high priest of all people, he was no ordinary Jew, he was the high priest. And yet he is the one who delivered him over to Pilate. He has a greater sin. Sometimes we have the greater sin because we have been given so much and yet make the wrong choices. Excuses don't change your guilt, or they don't cancel out guilt. Neither do circumstances, and neither do situations or whatever. Mm-hmm.
Remember where Jesus made the remark that, can't think of the people, but the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were better off than the ones that he was trying to describe.
Yeah.
They had to receive anything.
Exactly, yeah.
Better off. Okay. Well,
Yep.
what they did
Yeah, he said that Sodom and Gomorrah, talk about notorious sinners, they will stand up on Judgment Day and condemn them because Sodom and Gomorrah didn't have a lot of the blessings and revelation that they had, and of course, what Jesus says is they didn't see what the things that you've seen that I've done. And so your punishment, he implies, will be even worse than theirs. So, yeah, that's perfectly what we're dealing with here. Caiaphas and Pilate were not on a level playing field as far as acceptance of Jesus was concerned, and yet Pilate's declaring him innocent, and Caiaphas is working to get him crucified. So,
The thing is, sin is sin, so yet if we know more than what an individual, then to us and even to God, we are the greater sinner.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that we know that,
yep,
but we don't do it. And that's not the fact that sin itself is any greater,
yeah.
it's just the fact that we know.
Yep, Jesus said that exact thing too when he said, the servant who knew his master's will and then didn't do his master's will be beaten more severely than the servant who didn't know his master's will and did something worthy of a beating. So right there, you have greater guilt, maybe not greater sin, in that sense, but greater guilt at least. And so Caiaphas, which Jesus did say he had the greater sin, but also, the greater guilt in that. So notice also that he doesn't say that Caiaphas had the only sin. He had the greater sin. So even Jesus didn't declare Pilate to be innocent. He had sin in this, but it wasn't as great as those who brought Jesus to Pilate in the first place.
Judas and the apostles, and a lot of people think that what Judas did was greater than what any of the apostles. Yet the officers.
Yep, Judas, that's a good segue because Sunday morning we'll be looking at Judas. I considered combining that with one of either this or the lesson after it, but there's so much to consider with Judas about the whole unfolding of his decision near the end and his fate, really, that we could probably spend more than one lesson on that. So, Lord willing, Sunday morning we'll be looking at Judas, one of the greatest tragedies in all the Scriptures. And papers are on the table for the next few lessons. Yes, sir?
On Sunday, when Judgment Day does come for all of us, Pilate, Caiaphas, Herod, all the Jewish leaders, anyone involved in figuring out against Christ crucified, they're going to see him someday, not like they saw him on earth. It's going to be totally different. And the table is going to be reversed, and he'll be the judge, and they'll be the, what are they going to say?
They won't have much to say, will they?
No, they'll be speechless.
Yep. Speechless. Probably more so than ever before. And, it's sad. We just need to try to make sure that we're not one of those people. We're not speechless and have no reason to be put in that position because we have the revelations of God more than anybody else. We have more from God, not more than anybody has in the last several hundred years, but as far as the whole timeline of human history, we know more about God and His plan than any other time in history. And so we will have the least excuse as well. All right. Thank you for your comments and attention.